Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video for History Valley podcast. This is another in-person interview that I'm doing. This is part of the SBL conference from November the 18th to the 21st of 2023. And today I am doing an in-person interview with Dr. M. David Litwa. This is the first time that him and I have done an in-person interview since we have started doing interviews together a while back. So it's good to meet you in person, Litwa.
Absolutely, Jacob. Glad to be here. I'm glad you made it here. So you've made the effort to come where good scholarship is done, and that says a lot about your channel.
Oh, thank you. It means a lot. So I'd like to get right into the weeds of things in the 2nd century CE Gnosticism, the way Simon Magus is understood, the way Marcion is understood. And first, I'd like to start with Simon Magus. It seems that based on the current data that we have, the earliest mention of Simon Magus appears to be coming from Acts, unless some other sources is found later. And in Acts, it doesn't seem like Simon Magus is portrayed as a Gnostic at all. But in later literature, Simon Magus is recast as being the father of the Gnosticism, or the father of the heresy that became Gnosticism. So why is it that Simon Magus has become reappropriated as the father of the Gnostics?
Well, let me tell you my view.
Sure.
So my view is actually we have a source that's earlier than Acts, and that is the source which I'm arguing in my forthcoming book on Simon. I think you can already pre-order it on Bloomsbury. It's called Simon of Samaria, Contours of an Early Christian Movement. And what I'm looking at is Simon and the Simonians, because I'm not quite a mythicist when it comes to Simon, but I do believe that, as in the case of Jesus, there's very little that we can say about the historical Simon. Our earlier source is something called the Apophasis Megali, or the Great Declaration, and this is preserved in the Refutation of All Heresies, which is a 10-book heresiology that is written and finished up right around 222 of the Common Era. And it preserves a text that is written in Simon's own voice. And I date the text anywhere from 120 to 150, that shade of things. So I wouldn't say that, we might not be able to say that it's earlier than Acts, but it is at least contemporary with Acts. If you take a late dating of Acts, like I do, between, say, 130 and 150, then yes, it's probably later. But basically, we can think of this as simultaneous, as a contemporaneous document. The reason why I suspect that Acts is later is because it knows the heresiological tradition from Justin. And Justin Martyr is writing about 150, and he says that Simon is the great power of God. And if you look at the book of Acts, it's clear that this author knows that tradition, and says that Simon called him, or he was called by the Sumerians, the great power of God. So he knows that tradition. Maybe he knows it from Justin, maybe not, but he's similar to Justin in that respect, who's writing about 150. But the author of the Declaration doesn't think of Simon as the great power. In fact, if you read the Great Declaration, and I've got lots of material on it on my Patreon, it's very clear that Simon, who is speaking this new revelation, never identifies himself with the great power. And there's also a couple other interesting facts that indicate that this source is early. Number one, it doesn't mention Helen. And if any of you know anything about Simonian tradition, you know that the heresiologists, they love to mention Helen because they thought of her as a whore, or, to use modern neutral terms, a sex worker. And so they like to mention her because they thought that it would defame Simon, because she was effectively Simon's partner, whom he traveled with. And according to Simonians, she was probably a teacher, but Tertullian made fun of her specifically as riding on Simon's thighs. So he had some nasty things to say about her. We also, interestingly, in the Great Declaration, we don't have any citation of the Gospel of John. And in fact, that's quite unusual it would be quite unusual for a text written in the late 2nd century where John becomes universally known among all Christians, basically, and is used as an authoritative text, whether or not you're Gnostic or you're not. So that's curious as well. And also the use of embryology in the Great Declaration indicates that it may be dependent on Soranus of Ephesus, and we can date him fairly precisely. And that's how I come to the date of about 120, because if the author is dependent on Soranus, which is what I try to argue in my book, then he's probably writing between 120 and 150. And then by the time we get to 150, Simon is identified with the great power, and then that tradition sort of takes over. But by the time we get to the author of Acts, yes, Simon has been identified with the great power, and you're absolutely right. Neither in the Great Declaration nor in the Book of Acts, which are our earliest sources, is Simon ever called a Gnostic, and he's never said to know anything, special. Now, by extension, if you look at the Great Declaration, whoever wrote the Great Declaration, who was probably a early 2nd century Simonian, they envisioned Simon as a kind of prophet or not a revealer. So in that more general sense, if you think of Gnostic as a kind of knower of esoteric lore, then yes, in that general sense, you could call Simon a Gnostic. But in the specific sense of someone who believes that the Creator is evil, someone who believes in a chosen race, someone who believes in salvation by gnosis or knowledge, that does not describe early Simonian thought at all. In fact, what the Great Declaration is it's essentially an interpretation, an allegorical interpretation of Genesis 1, in which all 7 days are taken to represent beings, heavenly beings, and the 7th power, represented by the 7th day, is a figure of wisdom. And it's by conforming to this figure of wisdom that we human beings are saved. So in that respect, it's closer to Hellenistic Jewish concepts, where there's a figure of wisdom, like in the book of Sirach 24 or Proverbs 8 or the Wisdom of Solomon 7. And it's wisdom who is calling us toward deeper knowledge and salvation. There's no mention of Christ, not in the Great Declaration, obviously not in Jewish sources. So in that respect, the Great Declaration is very close to Jewish sources, Hellenistic Jewish sources, probably in Alexandria.
And so why is it that Simon Magus was transformed into becoming the father of the Gnostics? What was the point of that?
Yeah, okay. Thank you for reminding me. So yes, by 180, Irenaeus has him pegged as the father of the Gnostic tradition. And that's definitely a curious move. And, it's curious because there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of evidence for it. But if we can kind of reconstruct what happened, is Irenaeus is dependent mostly on Justin. And so Irenaeus accepts the tradition that Simon called himself the great power of God, that he had a partner called Helen, whom he identified with thought, or divine thought, and that Simon had come down from heaven much like Christ, and that he had appeared in Judea as Christ, and that after going through the crucifixion, he appeared later in Samaria as Simon and gave the full revelation. And the question here is this accurate Simonian teaching? Because we have to ask, all good scholars have to ask about sources. And if our earliest source is the Great Declaration, then we can kind of check on Irenaeus. Even if we say that Irenaeus has accurate information, we need to know a couple of things. Even if he's got accurate information, he still wants to, his chief aim is to create a kind of genealogy of heresy and to identify his modern opponents, the Valentinians, as going back to Simon, essentially so that he can vilify the Valentinians, who are in his day accepted as true Christians. So the whole reason he writes the heresiology is basically like, if you can imagine someone today, like a Presbyterian, saying that, oh, the Methodists, they derive their doctrine from some heretic in the 16th century or something like that. Or I guess it would be better to say, like, John Wesley was a heretic in the 19th century, and therefore all Methodists are heretics. That would be the kind of argument that Irenaeus is trying to make. He's trying to say that, oh, that Valentinian church down the street, actually, their teaching goes back to Simon Magus, whom you know from the Bible, and he was not a nice dude. He was actually a magician. And of course, part of my argument in the book is to say, no, this whole tradition of Simon as a magician is wrong. He's not a magician. He doesn't do any magical tricks. He doesn't gather fingernails, or, he doesn't clip off part of your hair and do magical experiments. He's not out there killing cats and draining the blood of bats and, making a big cauldron. I mean, none of that is ever actually said about Simon. So he's not a magician, and he's not a magus in the sense of, there were actual Persian officials out there who were magi, okay, and they appear in the New Testament with, at the birth of Jesus. But there's nothing particularly Persian about Simon either. So he's not a magus in the Persian sense either. So I've tried to convince people that we should refer to this Simon as Simon of Samaria, which is where he hung out, and just drop, the magus title, because he wasn't. There's no good evidence of that. That's a heresiological slur. It's sort of like saying Simon the Marxist or Simon the commie. That has the kind of equivalent sense. So it doesn't really add anything to the historical understanding of Simon. And the other thing to note is, if it's true, right, that by about 150, Simonians were promoting Simon as an incarnation of Christ, and they were calling him the great power, well, then that's just another variation and development of how Christianity developed. So in my view, Simonians were Christians. And if they weren't Christians, Irenaeus wouldn't be bothered by them. Let's face it. Like, he doesn't attack people who aren't Christians. So the whole reason Irenaeus attacks them is because he views them as Christians. So what that means is they were Christians, and it's clear they have Christ as part of their theology. But like the Sethians, they view Christ as undergoing multiple incarnations. There was an incarnation in Noah, there was an incarnation in Seth. For the Simonians, there was an incarnation of the great power in Jesus, and that same great power came as Simon. And the revelation that was made in Jesus is lesser than the revelation that was made in Simon, or by Simon. And so there's a kind of supersessionism involved here. And then there was another revelation where the great power came as the Spirit. So they're Trinitarian. They just have a different understanding of the Trinity. So that's where we are in the late 2nd century. We have to understand where these sources are coming from. If we buy them as legitimate, we have to understand this as a Christian theology, a variation of Christian theology. But it doesn't go back to the historical Simon, right? So the historical Simon probably dies in the 60s. And so there's about a 60-year gap between Simon and the Great Declaration, in which, we don't know what was going on. But Simonianism, as we know it, the first evidence of it is between 120 and 150 with the Great Declaration. And then by 150, these Simonians in Rome or somewhere in the West have developed this Trinitarian theology. And that's what Irenaeus picks up. It doesn't go back to Simon. It goes to the people around him in the late 2nd century, probably in Rome.
So was Irenaeus building on the idea that Simon Magus was already a heretic and he's just lumping them in with the Gnostics? Is that basically what he's doing?
Yeah, so like I said, he has a tradition based on Justin where Simon is identified, or later it's distorted so that Simon identifies himself as the great power, and therefore he's bad because he deifies himself. And that's why he ends up in my book, Desiring Divinity, which is all about figures who deify themselves, including Jesus. So if you're interested in that aspect, go read that book. So yes, but that tradition is only documented 150. Okay, so we have no earlier documentation of Simon's self-deification. Okay, so it's not like we can say, oh, well, the historical Simon must have called himself the great power.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's not how the sources work. We have to go by the documentation. Justin is the earliest source that tells us that. He's writing in 150 in Rome. That's the earliest attestation of the tradition. That's what Irenaeus picks up. And then he obviously imports it all the way back to the historical Simon, in the mid first century. But that's simply a historical error.
I would like to now shift to Marcion. I know that in the past, when I've asked you about this, you've said that we need to be careful and not call Marcion a Gnostic, because he's not necessarily a Gnostic. But some of his views do resemble Gnostic tendencies. Like, for instance, he says in the antithesis that Jesus is not the son of the Jewish God, but of a different, greater moral deity, distinct from the Jewish God. And we do see this idea being prevalent in Gnostic traditions. So do you see connections there?
Yes, of course. Yeah. So if you think of Marcionite Christianity or Marcionite theology and Gnostic theology, you can think of it as a kind of a Venn diagram where two circles are converging, and then there's shared material at the point of convergence. And that shared material is Marcion and so-called Gnostics, also called Sethians, agree that the creator is evil. Okay, so that's the fundamental agreement that they share. They also share on the ethical level, which is related to the theology. On the ethical level, they also share a rigorous asceticism, by which I mean they are both promoting celibacy as the correct way of living for the upper members of their churches. Obviously, Marcionite Christianity, it's a big movement, it's well networked, it's everywhere by the late second century. So, when you go to join a Marcionite church, they don't demand that you divorce.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, they say, and as I read it, if you want to be baptized in the Marcionite church, you have to make a commitment to celibacy. That doesn't necessarily involve divorce, because in antiquity, it was often the case that celibate people were married. They just chose to make a commitment not to have sexual intercourse in marriage. And this was quite a common, today that sounds like, oh, well, that's silly. But in antiquity, this was actually quite common, because there were a lot of moralists, such as the Stoics and others, who said, yeah, the purpose of sex is reproduction. So if you're done with reproduction, like if you've had kids and you don't want any more kids, well, sex has no purpose. This whole idea of sex as, intimacy didn't really strike them as true. Sex was solely to reproduce the human race. Once you've done your job, that's it, So as an ethical position, they are agreed that that's the highest state, but they don't require that of everyone. Now, where Gnostics and Marcionites disagree is on a bunch of other things, like Marcion doesn't believe that anything in the Old Testament is valid for his churches. He doesn't think that Seth, is an incarnation of Christ. Okay, he doesn't believe in a seed of Seth. He apparently doesn't believe in anything like a divine spark that needs to escape this world. And yeah, Marcion is also quite distinctive in emphasizing Pauline writings. Whereas if you look over to Sethian material, they know of Paul, like the hypothesis of the archons or the nature of the rulers, if you prefer, it mentions Paul. But in terms of systematically engaging with Paul and other New Testament writings, you don't really see that. At least they're not, promoting that at the surface. But Marcion is different in that he's the great architect of the New Testament. He's the first attested person who combines a gospel with a Pauline letter collection, which is the kind of nucleus of our New Testament, even the one that, the 27 book canon that is upheld today. It's basically gospel plus Paul, and then they've added what are called the Catholic epistles, and they finally got around to adding Revelation, but that took, until the 4th century. So Marcion's great idea to create a New Testament of gospel plus Pauline letter collection, that was his baby, so to speak. That was his creation. The Sethians, they don't appear to have a New Testament canon. Obviously, they know of the New Testament. I mean, no one can ignore the New Testament, but they seem much more interested in Hebrew Bible figures like Seth and kind of redeeming them and making them the source of revelation. But of course, they ignore, Abraham and all the Jewish patriarchs, and they try to focus on others like Adam and Seth, who are pre-Jewish because they renounce Judaism. So they look for the pre-Jewish heroes to promote their revelations.
Did the Gnostics adopt these views on the Jewish God being distinct from the Father of Jesus from Marcion, or do you think those views are earlier than Marcion?
I don't typically like to play the game of who's first,
Okay.
like the question of origins. I kind of think that the question of origins is a bit misleading. There's such a thing as mutual causation. Like we in our logical brains have it, this causes this. But you can have two, playing cards that fall into line and they hit each other at the same time and form a kind of tent structure. It's like they're both simultaneously the cause of the other card standing up. What I see going on is Marcion and so-called Gnostic thinkers, they're basically contemporary. So I would imagine they're sharing notes. But, when we're dealing with, 120 and 130 of the Common Era, this is when what I call negative demiurgy is created. The view of a evil deity, evil creator. This is when it gets kickstarted by Christians. Okay, this is when they really pick up the idea. And so Marcion at that point is probably in Asia Minor. Gnostics or Sethians, maybe they're in Antioch, maybe they're in Alexandria, maybe both. But certainly the idea was in the air, so to speak. And I can't say who's first. I wrote a book called The Evil Creator, in which I argue that, this mythology of the evil creator is pre-Christian. So if it's originates anywhere, I would put my money on Alexandria. But that doesn't mean that Marcion couldn't have independently, just upon his reading of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament, as it came to be called, it doesn't mean that he couldn't have also, said, oh my God, the creator is a monster. It only takes that much. Like many readers today, they email me and say, well, yeah, I've always kind of believed the Old Testament was a monster. The God of the Old Testament was a monster. How could you not? I mean, he kills little children and floods the earth, commits, mass genocide, prevents Adam and Eve from getting knowledge from the tree of knowledge. Why would he do that? He kicks them out of the garden so that they can't live forever. Why would he do that? I mean, he says that he's jealous. Well, I mean, he openly admits to being jealous, and he openly admits to being unjust by saying that if you do something wrong, I'll punish you to the third and fourth generation, so that your great grandchild is going to pay for your sins. I mean, honestly, folks, you need not go any farther than the Hebrew Bible itself. People can independently come up with the same idea if they're reading the same text, and they have the same presuppositions that, you know, these are things that a God, if there is a God, just does not do.
I'd like to talk a little bit about the pastoral epistles of 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. Some scholars see polemical ideas in 1st Timothy and 2nd Timothy, anti-Gnostic ideas. Like in 1st Timothy, it seems to be speaking against an antithesis, and 2nd Timothy, it seems to be critical of heresy coming from some gnosis or not, a group professing gnosis. So, do you see that as well? Do you see the pastorals as criticizing Marcion's antithesis and the gnosis?
I do. Yeah, I mean, but when you look at the material evidence, which is where everyone should start, you see that in the earliest canon formation, or the earliest list of authoritative books, Marcion doesn't know the pastorals. And it's not because Marcion ever says that the pastorals are bad, it's just because he does not know of them. So they did not exist, you know, in the 140s, because no one knew of them. I mean, there's no citation of them, so probably they didn't exist. I mean, there's certainly no attestation. So when did they exist? When were they incorporated? Well, when we get our first references, which is late 2nd century, really Irenaeus mentions the gnosis falsely so called, which is a famous phrase taken from 1 Timothy 6. And yes, it's absolutely, I think whoever is impersonating Paul there, he knows of gnosis. So he probably knows of so-called Gnostics. In other words, Christians who were claiming greater gnosis. And he knows of Marcion because he's saying that there are Christians out there who are prohibiting marriage. To be precise, Marcion never prohibited marriage to, you know, actually said that, oh, you can't get married, like you can't come into my church unless you divorce. He never said that, but he did say that, yeah, if you want to reach the upper ranks, if you want to be a full member, yes, you need to stop having sex. And ideally that would involve a non-married state. But the pastoral, as he's called, the author of the pastorals, twists that Marcionite doctrine to say that he prohibits marriage, which is an easy kind of unnuanced, nasty way of pulling out the rug from under your enemy. And yeah, so I do absolutely think that the pastorals are probably mid-2nd century, written, you know, right around the time of the book of Acts. And there's no question in my mind they are anti-Gnostic and anti-Marcionite.
So would it be fair to say that whoever this pastor is, he was someone sifting through Paul's letters, trying to come up with, I wonder if I can misinterpret Paul somewhere over here deliberately to make it fit my criticisms of Marcion and the other Gnostics, but I can't. So I'm just going to make up letters that Paul never wrote to get what I want.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would maybe put it a little bit more charitably than that.
Okay.
I mean, you can take one of two directions. Irenaeus can interpret Paul against the Gnostics.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he tries to pull that off. But yes, probably a more effective way of doing it is to engage in forgery and to rewrite Paul. But whoever the pastor is, I mean, I think that they are, I don't think they're disingenuous in the sense that I don't think they're saying, I'm going to intentionally distort Paul. I think that they really do believe in a kind of conservative Paul. Like, if you think of Paul along two trajectories, there's Paul of justification by faith, the wrath of God, and apocalyptic Paul. And the pastor likes that version of Paul. He's, a good guy. And then there's the kind of speculative Paul that's, you get in Colossians and Ephesians. And I think the pastor didn't like that particular version of Paul, where he's talking about esoteric knowledge and, pre-existence and etc. And so, yeah, you can pick your Paul and you can rewrite Paul, just as many authors were rewriting Genesis. They were rewriting the Bible. They were rewriting Scripture, and they thought that was okay. And they really believed that Paul would have agreed with them. And they made sure that history agreed with them.
So I'm going to ask you this question. It's going to sound a little like the one I asked earlier about about which idea came first, kind of thing. I'm going to phrase it a little differently. I understand what you were saying earlier, that you don't want to play that game of which one came first. But I'm not going to be quite asking it like that. What I'm asking is, where do we see the earliest evidence of the inception of this Gnostic movement? And is it possible at all that do we have any evidence at all of where they may have derived at least some of their ideas from other sources? Do we know any of that?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So we know that they're interacting with Neo-Pythagorean sources, Neo-Pythagorean theories about the origin of the universe. So the monad giving rise to the dyad, creating a triad and a tetrad. And this is where the idea of aeons or eternities seems to come from, the idea of a primal mind having a primal thought. The primal mind is the monad, primal thought is the dyad. And then there are four lights, which is the primal quaternity or tetrad. And some of them also later talked about further proliferations, like an ogdoad and a decad. So it seems to be highly Neo-Pythagorean. So we know that they were engaged in Neo-Pythagorean thought, and that was very popular in the early 2nd century in Alexandria in particular. So if we had more fragments from, say, Basilides and Valentinus, we'd have a clearer picture. But to my mind, all the ingredients are there in Alexandria. Some would say that the ingredients are there in Antioch or the Orontes Valley as well. And we do have attestations of people, theologians like Menander and Saturninus. But there's no reason why we can't combine the idea of Alexandria and Antioch, which are only a week away by boat, why we couldn't see, the origin of Gnostic Christianity as basically shared from Egypt all the way up to the Levant and the northern Syria. I mean, that whole arc was ripe for Gnostic Christianity. So that's where I would put my money on. And, hopefully someday we'll have more fragments of Basilides and more fragments of Valentinus. By the time Valentinus goes to Rome, probably in the mid-130s, then we can document that those ideas move from east to west. So certainly those ideas have moved to Rome by 140. And of course, Marcion is in Rome by the mid-140s as well. So by the mid-140s, everything's in place. And Rome everything has confluence to Rome. So that's as much as we know. I mean, we might be able, with more evidence, to give more detailed reconstruction, but that's as much as we know. So I should say I do have a plane to catch. I should just take one more question.
Sure, sure. Yeah. Does it seem like that the Gnostic movement is, when the Christian Gnostic movement begins, that they're combining elements of Platonic Gnosticism, and Pythagorean thought, and integrating it into the context of Christianity and their reinterpretation of the Bible?
Yeah. Well, in a sense, everyone's doing that because, even so-called proto-Orthodox thinkers, I mean, they still have this negative theology where they say, yeah, sure, God is a monad. God is unknowable. God is unnameable. God is unrecognizable. God is beyond being. All these formulations became orthodox as well, but every single formulation comes from Middle Platonic negative theology. So, I mean, if I can phrase it this way, I mean, the Gnostics were emphasizing certain parts of Plato and Neo-Pythagorean thought that were unfamiliar to Irenaeus. I mean, certainly Irenaeus is unfamiliar, and he's shocked by the integration of Neo-Pythagorean thought into Christianity. And he makes fun of it, because he says that, we got an ogdoad, and we've got a decad, and we've got a dodecad. I mean, how silly is all of this? I don't understand where this comes from. But of course, we do understand where it comes from. It's from Christians who are trying to integrate Neo-Pythagorean thought. They're trying to do serious philosophical work on the origin of the world. So that's what they're trying to do. And yeah, they're both picking in, just like Christians do today. They pick whatever they want from the dominant cultural zeitgeist, and they build in different ways. And that's what was going on in the 2nd century.
Well, thank you for joining me today. I'm David Litwa.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you for bringing scholarship to a broader audience.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.